He set multiple deadlines over the past 4 months, and in each case, when the Russians did not alter course, Trump did nothing. So I think Trump has significant leverage, but he hasn't used it. And if he used it, he might have a chance of beginning to affect the calculations in Moscow that could lead the Russians to adapt their negotiating position.
So Donald Trump is currently speaking at the White House ahead of his meeting with the Russian president tomorrow. In the last few moments, Donald Trump stressed that a second meeting with the Russian leader would be the more significant one.
But the more important meeting will be the second meeting that we're having. We're going to have a meeting with President Putin, President Zelensky, myself, and maybe we'll bring some of the European leaders along, maybe not. I don't know that it's going to be very important. We're going to see what happens. And I think President Putin will make peace. I think President Zelensky will make peace. We'll see if they can get along. And if they can, it'll be great. You know, I've solved 6 wars in the last 6 months, a little more than 6 months now.
Well, we can speak now to Katie Balls, the Times of Washington editor. Katie, thank you very much for your time. Tell us, in essence, this is our last sort of formal face-to-face encounter with Donald Trump before that meeting with Putin tomorrow. What's he said this evening?
Well, as you touched on, I don't think there's a particularly new line in the sense Donald Trump doesn't want to talk about the details of what he may try to agree with Putin. But instead, I think throughout the week, when we have had what have been many public appearances in different forms, a different emphasis in each one. And I think the main takeaways from the comments so far today is this talk again of the second meeting. Now, earlier in the week, Donald Trump said out of courtesy he'd call Zelensky first out of his after his meeting with Putin. But it does feel as though, and perhaps this is down to the phone call yesterday with European leaders, the work of the UK government and others, it feels as though Trump is now talking up even more the importance of Zelensky effectively agreeing to whatever is discussed by Trump and Putin, and the sense that you do need that backing, that second meeting, if things are really going to come to a point where you can start to look at ending the conflict. And I do think there's a subtle shift, at least in some of the rhetoric, perhaps earlier in the week, where it's much more, this is between me and Vladimir Putin, and then we'll see how we go. It is now the bigger picture is we have to get Ukraine on side in some form if this is really going to go anywhere.
Yeah, which I think will be a relief for the European leaders listening to that. Katie, we've had, I guess, a bit of management of expectations today. Donald Trump says there's a 25% chance his meeting with Vladimir Putin on Friday isn't going to be successful. What would it not being successful look like?
I think not being successful, obviously, some would define it in different ways. You could have some people who would say not being successful would be an agreement which Ukraine couldn't live with. But I think what Trump means is that the meeting doesn't lead to much at all. There's no reason to have a second meeting. There's no great breakthrough. And you go back to the status quo. The conflict that Donald Trump once said he could fix within 24 hours continues to go on. And there's no real ending in sight. I think that's what Donald Trump means when he talks about failure. And I think this slightly downplaying of expectations started a day or so ago when Donald Trump also said, this is just a listening exercise. Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, was saying this is the first meeting. Donald Trump will be meeting Putin, looking him in the eye and getting a sense of things, but suggesting a way no one should put too much on this one as the final set piece.
Yeah, we also heard yesterday, didn't we, that Donald Trump has said, look, there will be serious consequences for Russia if that meeting tomorrow isn't a success. But he is being careful in what he says when pressed, and there are people more reporters asking questions of Donald Trump right now as we speak, to say, well, what would those consequences actually be? We don't have an answer.
No, I mean, sanctions is one thing that comes up, of course. And of course, this meeting is really happening. One of the main factors, because there was a deadline looming for Putin to come to the table. Otherwise, Donald Trump said he was going to take tough action against Russia. And when Steve Witkoff went to Moscow, he left thinking there was a breakthrough. Now, optimists take that to mean that this could be a really significant summit on Friday in terms of ending the war in Ukraine. But there are pessimists who will say, and skeptics who will make the point that perhaps it was in the interest of Russia to suggest they were a bit more interested in speaking so as to put off this initial deadline where they could have had sanctions, other actions taken against them by the White House, and therefore, is this going to be a meeting which is a good use of everyone's time, or is it a delaying exercise? And you look at some of the things Putin and the Russian force have been doing when it comes to the conflict in recent days. They're not stopping yet. They're trying to make advances.
Yeah, Katie, thank you very much for the update. This has been sort of so much ramping up speculation ahead of tomorrow, so it's been brilliant to have your sort of even steer on what we can expect. Katie Balls, the Times Washington editor there. Well, let's get more reaction now from Steven Pifer, former US ambassador to Ukraine. Stephen, thank you for your time.
Happy to be here.
Donald Trump says he's doubling down the pressure on Putin. Do you think so far the groundwork that's been laid for this meeting tomorrow, that we will have some form of a successful outcome?
Well, I actually don't see any pressure that President Trump has put on Putin over the last 7 months. He's talked about it. He set multiple deadlines over the past 4 months. And in each case, when the Russians did not alter course, Trump did nothing. So I think Trump has significant leverage, but he hasn't used it. And if he used it, he might have a chance of beginning to affect the calculations in Moscow that could lead the Russians to adapt their negotiating position.
Trump has literally just said Putin will not mess around with him. But we have heard, haven't we, many times, an admission from the US president himself that he has a phone call with President Putin, which he thinks is a good phone call and is constructive. And then hours later, missiles land in Ukraine. So what do you think gives the US president new confidence to say Putin won't mess around with him?
Well, I think originally there was this meeting a week ago, Wednesday, in Moscow, where Trump's negotiator, Stephen Witkoff, met with Putin. And there's now multiple accounts that say that Mr. Witkoff, who apparently met with Putin and his team by himself, misunderstood what the Russians were proposing. And that may have been the cause of Trump last Wednesday tweeting out great progress was made, when in fact what it sounds like Witkoff was given was pretty much a rehash of the current Russian position. Now, I think another factor here is that for reasons that are not really clear, Trump has wanted to meet with Putin. Putin, of course, welcomes this because this is going to be the first time that Putin has met a major Western leader since Russia launched its all-out invasion back in February of 2022. Moreover, Putin, I believe, sees an opportunity here. He thinks that if he can get Trump in the one-on-one meeting that's going to open up their session in Alaska, that he can spin, he can use his command of the facts and the details, and perhaps get Trump to agree to significant elements of the Russian negotiating demands. That would be a big victory for Putin.
Yeah, we're trying to assess, really, to what extent Ukraine's voice will be heard at that meeting tomorrow. Donald Trump seems to be suggesting tonight, as he had done already this week, that there will be, if the meeting goes well, this first one, another one where Zelensky and ultimately then Europe's voice is at the table. For Zelensky, what does he need to happen tomorrow so that the atmosphere, the conditions are ripe for a constructive second meeting?
Yeah, it seems to me that the best outcome that could come out of tomorrow is an agreement whereby Trump persuades Putin, you accept an unconditional and general ceasefire. That then comes for the base for negotiations, which then have to bring the Ukrainians in. But I think the chances of that are quite low because Putin has made pretty clear that he's not interested in just a ceasefire. So if they can't get a ceasefire, my hope is that this meeting results in a discussion, but really no meeting of minds between Trump and Putin, because I fear that any meeting of minds could be to the detriment of the Ukrainian position.
What would be the best outcome for Zelensky tomorrow?
No, I think the best outcome would be if Trump and Putin agree on a general ceasefire, and that takes hold, and that there's a second meeting in which Zelensky is included. But I think the chances of that, unfortunately, are quite low.
We've also had President Zelensky meeting with Keir Starmer today, talking about security guarantees. Let's say that best case scenario plays out and tomorrow we have a ceasefire. What Europe is saying is they will provide Ukraine with security guarantees. What does that mean in your mind, in practice, if Russia then breached a ceasefire?
Right. Well, it seems to me that there are really three types of security guarantees. The one that I believe would be the best and the most effective would be to bring Ukraine into NATO. And bear in mind, Ukraine would not just be a security consumer, it would bring the most battle-hardened military in Europe into the alliance. But for a variety of reasons, that would be, I think, hard to do, certainly in the near term. A second idea, which has been put forward by the British and the French, is this idea of a coalition of the willing, who would put together a military force that could be on the ground in Ukraine to provide assurance to the Ukrainians that any settlement would hold. But the Europeans understandably have asked for some U.S. backstop, which apparently is not there yet. The third idea would be if there's no guarantee by a Western country to Ukraine that the West simply agrees to fill Ukraine with all the weapons it needs. You're talking about hundreds of fighter aircraft, hundreds and hundreds of tanks and such, so that Ukraine has a very strong military that would deter any Russian future invasion. So I think you have to have one of those elements there, because you're not going to get the Ukrainians to consider, I think, any kind of even temporary acceptance of Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory unless the Ukrainians have confidence that the rest of Ukraine has a firm security guarantee.
What do you think will happen in terms of, this is obviously a secondary part of the process, but Donald Trump was talking about land swaps today. He used some sort of very clunky language saying, we're going to have to divvy things up. That was an interview he did with Fox News. I mean, there is a feeling in Ukraine that there would be fury if land occupied by Russia was permanently lost. But do you think that is going to be an inevitable part of whatever negotiations are to come?
When Mr. Trump talks about land swaps, I get nervous because I think he thinks of this as empty land. But in fact, if you're looking at places like Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, you're talking about land on which millions of Ukrainians live. And most of them don't want to be Russians. So I think they need to bear that in mind. But also, I think some of the land swaps, here's where they get dangerous. So the Russians expect, or the Russian demand is, that Ukraine withdraw from parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia that the Russians don't even occupy. So it's not clear to me what kind of land swap is in mind here. I think when the Russians are talking about land swaps, they're basically talking about a one-way arrangement in which Ukraine cedes land to Russia. And understandably, that's not going to be acceptable to the Ukrainians.
Do you think in some form there'll have to be some concessions from Ukraine?
I was in Kyiv about 3 months ago. And what I heard from some Ukrainians was, look, we understand, we may not be able to get all of our territory back, and that there might be a readiness to accept some loss of territory de facto. I think the Ukrainians have been very clear they would not accept that legally. But they've also said, in order to have that, the rest of Ukraine has to have a firm security guarantee. And that there's really no interest in Ukraine in even thinking about even temporarily giving up territory without a security guarantee that gives Ukrainians assurance that 2 or 3 years down the road, the Russians don't relaunch this war.
That's the big question, isn't it? What guarantees can be given to Ukraine so that, and we are still almost actually getting ahead of ourselves here. This is when we've had a ceasefire and then some kind of peace deal. But what kind of guarantees that Ukraine could have that Russia won't act in a similar vein in a year, 2 years, 10 years? Donald Trump has said this evening, I think Putin and Zelensky can make peace. Do you believe that as well?
I think at the end of the day, this is going to have to be an arrangement largely negotiated by Russians and Ukrainians. This is, though, I think, where Trump, if he were serious about providing leverage, and so I'm thinking of things like asking the American Congress to provide additional money for Ukraine so that it can buy weapons. It's things like Trump pressuring the European Union to agree to outright seize the frozen Russian central bank assets, that's about $300 billion, and put them into a fund that Ukraine could use both for reconstruction and for buying weapons. Under those conditions, Ukraine would have the funding to continue the war for years to come. And what you need to do is create in Moscow the perception that the Russians cannot achieve their goals on the battlefield, and that if they continue to try to do so, they're only going to face growing military, political, and economic costs. And until you get that change of perception in the Kremlin, you're not going to get a Russian approach that begins to move towards some kind of accommodation that might allow Russia and Ukraine to find some middle ground for a settlement.
Yeah.
That's where, unfortunately, President Trump has cards. He's not dealt them to himself, though, and so he actually goes to Anchorage in a weaker position than he might.
Stephen, thank you very much for your time. Steven Pifer, the former US ambassador to Ukraine, on his analysis of really those last final preparations before this meeting tomorrow. The meeting taking place just over 24 hours. We believe it'll be about 8:30 tomorrow evening. Of course, here on Times Radio, we will steer you through all of it. Steve, thank you very much.